For 40 years, one man controlled everything in a country the size of France, sitting on one of the largest oil deposits in sub-Saharan Africa.
Every barrel pumped, every dollar earned, every contract signed, every foreign company that wanted access to the oil had to go through him. And for 40 years, the money flowed. Billions and billions of petrodollars, enough to transform every citizen of that country into one of the wealthiest people on the continent.
But that's not the crazy part.
The crazy part is that after 40 years of oil wealth, after billions in revenue that should have rebuilt roads, schools, hospitals, and cities, the country ranked among the poorest nations on Earth. Child mortality rates that placed it in the bottom 10 globally. Life expectancy of 52 years, 70% of the population living on less than $2 a day. A country swimming in oil whose citizens were dying of preventable diseases because there were no functioning hospitals. The crazy part is that while his people had no running water, no electricity, no schools, his son was buying a private jet, a $40 million Malibu mansion, a yacht, a fleet of Ferraris, and Michael Jackson memorabilia worth millions of dollars. In cash, laundered through American shell companies, European banks, and the same financial system that lectures the world about corruption and good governance. And the craziest part of all? The oil companies knew. The American banks knew. The European governments knew. The International Monetary Fund knew. The World Bank knew. Everybody who dealt with this country for 40 years knew exactly where the money was going, and they kept signing the contracts because the oil was there, and the oil was worth more than the people. His name is Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. His country is Equatorial Guinea. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how one man transformed a tiny African nation into his personal bank account for 4 decades. How the international financial system actively enabled every step of the theft, and why the people who paid the price have received almost nothing, while the people who enabled the crime have faced almost no consequences. This is the story of the longest-running oil kleptocracy in modern history. To understand what happened in Equatorial Guinea, you need to understand what the country was before the oil. Equatorial Guinea is a small nation on the west coast of Central Africa, consisting of a mainland territory and several islands in the Gulf of Guinea. At independence from Spain in 1968, it was one of the poorest countries in Africa. Its economy depended on cocoa and timber. Its population was approximately 300,000 people. It had almost no infrastructure, almost no institutions, and almost no capacity for self-governance after nearly a century of colonial rule. The first president, Francisco Macias Nguema, was one of the most brutal dictators in African history. He ruled through terror, killing or exiling a third of the entire population, destroying the educated class, closing schools, and transforming the country into what international observers called the Auschwitz of Africa. By the time he was overthrown in 1979, Equatorial Guinea was a shattered state. The man who overthrew him was his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. Obiang had served as a military officer under his uncle and had personally overseen the prison where political opponents were tortured and killed. When he seized power in August 1979, he ordered his uncle executed by a firing squad. The firing squad reportedly had to be drunk to carry out the order because they feared the man they were killing was a sorcerer. Obiang declared himself president. He released some political prisoners. He allowed some schools to reopen. He presented himself to the international community as a moderate reformer after the horror of his uncle's rule. The bar was so low that almost anything looked like improvement. Western governments extended recognition. Aid organizations returned. The world moved on. For the first 15 years of Obiang's rule, Equatorial Guinea remained one of the poorest and most obscure countries in Africa. There was nothing particularly notable about it. A small authoritarian state in Central Africa, corrupt and poorly governed, but not dramatically different from dozens of similar situations across the continent. Then, in 1995, everything changed. American oil companies exploring offshore waters made one of the most significant hydrocarbon discoveries in African history. The offshore fields of Equatorial Guinea contained billions of barrels of high-quality crude oil. For a country of 400,000 people, the scale of the discovery was almost incomprehensible. Per capita, Equatorial Guinea had one of the largest oil reserves of any nation on Earth. The oil money began flowing in 1997. Within a decade, Equatorial Guinea had one of the highest per capita GDPs in Africa, nominally comparable to some European nations. On paper, every citizen of Equatorial Guinea should have been wealthy. The oil revenue, divided equally among the population, would have provided each person with tens of thousands of dollars annually. More than enough to eliminate poverty, build world-class infrastructure, and fund excellent schools and hospitals for every citizen. None of that happened because the money did not flow to the citizens. It flowed to Obiang and to his family, and to the small network of loyalists who helped him maintain power, and through them into the global financial system where it was laundered, invested, and spent on an extraordinary array of personal luxuries while the country that generated the wealth remained desperately poor. The mechanism of the theft was elegant in its simplicity. Obiang controlled the state oil company, GE Petrol, through direct personal authority. Foreign oil companies, including ExxonMobil, Marathon, and Hess, signed production sharing agreements with the government. These agreements required the companies to deposit revenue into government accounts. But in Equatorial Guinea, government accounts and Obiang's personal accounts were the same thing. There was no separation between the state treasury and the president's personal finances because Obiang had ensured no such separation existed. A particularly revealing window into the system was the relationship between Equatorial Guinea and Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. Riggs was one of the oldest and most prestigious banks in America, known as the Bank of Presidents for its proximity to the American political establishment. From the late 1990s through 2004, Riggs held dozens of accounts for Obiang, his family members, and the Equatorial Guinea government. The accounts were often indistinguishable from each other. A 2004 Senate investigation into Riggs Bank found that over $700 million had passed through Equatorial Guinea-related accounts. The investigation found that Riggs had repeatedly failed to report suspicious transactions, had assisted Obiang in moving money in ways designed to obscure its origins, and had maintained accounts for individuals sanctioned by U.S. authorities. The investigation described Riggs as having turned a blind eye to evidence suggesting the bank was being used as a repository for funds that may have been the product of foreign corruption. Riggs Bank was fined $25 million, which was at the time the largest penalty ever assessed against a bank for violations of the Bank Secrecy Act. Riggs subsequently collapsed and was sold. No individual banker was criminally prosecuted, and the money that had flowed through those accounts, the hundreds of millions that represented the oil wealth of Equatorial Guinea citizens, was never recovered. While this was happening in Washington, in Equatorial Guinea itself, the conditions for ordinary citizens remained catastrophic. The country had oil revenue sufficient to provide every citizen with a comfortable middle-class life. Instead, the infant mortality rate was among the highest in the world. 70% of children under 5 were malnourished. Clean water was unavailable to most of the population. The school system had essentially collapsed. Hospitals had no medicines, no equipment, and often no doctors. International aid organizations that attempted to work in Equatorial Guinea reported conditions that were difficult to reconcile with a country producing hundreds of millions of dollars in oil revenue monthly. The gap between what the country should have been able to afford and what it actually provided its citizens was one of the most extreme examples of kleptocracy ever documented. The person who came to symbolize this gap was Obiang's son, Teodorin Nguema Obiang. Teodorin held several government positions, including Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, a role in which his official salary was approximately $4,000 per month. On this salary, Teodorin managed to accumulate an extraordinary collection of assets in the United States. A Department of Justice investigation that began in 2010 documented what Teodorin had purchased using funds from accounts connected to Equatorial Guinea government revenues. He had purchased a $38 million mansion in Malibu, California, one of the most expensive residential properties in the United States. He had purchased a $60 million private jet. He had purchased a 275-foot superyacht worth approximately $120 million. He had spent millions on a fleet of luxury automobiles, including multiple Bugattis, Ferraris, and Lamborghinis. He had spent millions on Michael Jackson memorabilia, including a crystal-covered glove. The total assets identified by the DOJ investigation exceeded $300 million. Teodorin's official income over the relevant period was approximately $160,000. The gap between his income and his expenditure was bridged entirely by money from Equatorial Guinea's oil revenues, passed through shell companies, entertainment industry connections, and compliant American financial institutions. In 2014, the Department of Justice filed a civil forfeiture action against Teodorin's American assets under the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative. The case resulted in a settlement in 2014 in which Teodorin agreed to forfeit approximately $30 million in assets, including his Malibu mansion and several other properties. He admitted no wrongdoing. He was not criminally prosecuted in the United States. He returned to Equatorial Guinea, where he was subsequently named vice president by his father. The international response to Equatorial Guinea's kleptocracy was characterized by extraordinary inconsistency. Western governments that routinely lectured African nations about corruption and good governance simultaneously maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with Obiang's government. American oil companies continued operating in Equatorial Guinea. American diplomats attended official functions. The United States maintained an embassy in Malibu. The African Union, of which Equatorial Guinea is a member, periodically raised concerns about governance standards. The United Nations Development Program documented the gap between oil revenues and human development outcomes. But sustained international pressure that might have changed Obiang's behavior was never applied. Because the oil was too valuable and the country too small and strategically unimportant for any major power to risk the relationship over the welfare of its citizens. France maintained particularly close relations with Equatorial Guinea as part of its broader network of relationships with Francophone and Lusophone African states. French investigations into the assets of African leaders in France, the so-called bien mal acquis, or ill-gotten gains investigations, did eventually reach Teodorin. In 2017, a French court convicted Teodorin in absentia for corruption and money laundering, sentencing him to 3 years in prison suspended and ordering the confiscation of approximately 150 million euros in assets held in France, including a mansion in Paris and a fleet of luxury automobiles. Teodorin did not appear for the French proceedings. He has not served any prison time. He continues to serve as vice president of Equatorial Guinea. The assets confiscated in France have been the subject of lengthy legal proceedings about how to dispose of them in a way that actually benefits the citizens of Equatorial Guinea rather than simply enriching the French state. Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo is, as of this recording, still the president of Equatorial Guinea.
He has been in power since 1979, making him one of the longest-serving heads of government in the world. He has won multiple elections with results that international observers have consistently described as neither free nor fair. He has presided over 40 years of oil wealth that has left his country's citizens among the poorest and most poorly served populations on Earth. The citizens of Equatorial Guinea have received almost nothing from the oil wealth extracted from their land and their waters over 4 decades. The roads are poor. The schools are inadequate. The hospitals are dangerous. Life expectancy remains dramatically below what the country's income should support. Malaria, a preventable and treatable disease, remains a leading cause of death in a country with sufficient oil revenue to have eliminated it decades ago. Meanwhile, the Obiang family has accumulated wealth that places them among the richest families in Africa. The exact total is impossible to determine because of the opacity of the shell company structures used to hold the assets. Estimates range from several hundred million to several billion dollars. The money is distributed across real estate in France, the United States, and elsewhere, financial accounts in Switzerland and other jurisdictions, and business interests in multiple sectors. The story of Equatorial Guinea is not primarily a story about one corrupt family. It is a story about a system. The oil companies that signed production agreements knowing the revenue would be stolen. The banks that processed the transactions knowing the source of the funds. The governments that maintained diplomatic relationships knowing what those relationships legitimized. The law firms and accounting firms and corporate service providers that structured the shell companies and trusts and investment vehicles that held the stolen wealth. Every one of these actors made a choice, and every one of these choices made the theft possible. 40 years of oil, 40 years of poverty. One family, $300 million in assets identified in a single American investigation. Billions more unaccounted for. A vice president convicted in France who continues to serve in government. And a president who has never faced any legal consequence in any jurisdiction for any aspect of the theft. The oil is still flowing. The poverty is still there. And Obiang is still president. If you believe the public deserves to know where the money actually goes, subscribe. Every week we cover the frauds, the scandals, and the financial crimes the system would rather you forget.